They thought they could bully anyone. They targeted a quiet elderly woman, never realizing who was sitting beside her. But the moment her son looked up, the entire cafe froze. Like the video, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from. The evening was meant to be simple, quiet, and special, nothing more. After weeks of grueling training sessions, public appearances, charity events, and endless schedules packed shoulder to shoulder, Chuck Norris finally carved out the one thing he had been promising his mother for months: a peaceful dinner together. No cameras, no fans interrupting with requests for photos, no studios demanding yet another retake. Just him and the woman who had shaped him into the man the world knew, a man whose legends sometimes seemed bigger than life itself. For Chuck, this dinner was not about food. It was about grounding himself, reconnecting with the one constant warmth in his life. His mother moved slowly these days with a grace that seemed softer, more fragile than before. Her hair, a silver-white cloud pulled neatly into a bun, framed her face in a way that made her look both delicate and wise. She held her purse with both hands, fingers curled gently around the straps as though she feared dropping it. Her eyes, though still bright, had a tender depth in them, the kind that comes from a lifetime of kindness and quiet strength. She wore a modest dress with a light cardigan draped over her shoulders, giving her the warm, homely appearance she never sought to cultivate. It simply radiated from her naturally. Chuck offered his arm as they walked from the car to the entrance of the small cafe he had chosen deliberately. It sat tucked between a dry cleaner's shop and a tiny bookstore, the kind of place most people walk past without a second glance. But Chuck remembered it from years ago, long before fame found him. Back then, he would sometimes come here after long training sessions, seeking comfort in their homemade soup and freshly baked bread. The place had not changed much since then: warm wooden tables, soft amber lights, and a faint hum of old jazz that drifted through the air. It was calm and welcoming, almost like stepping into another time. As he opened the door for his mother, Chuck made sure to steady her by the elbow. She smiled at him, a small, grateful smile that always made him soften on the inside. The hostess greeted them with pleasant warmth, instantly recognizing Chuck, though she did her best not to show it too openly. He appreciated that. He nodded politely and asked for a table near the window, where the late afternoon sunlight still lingered, soft and golden. The cafe smelled of spices, fresh dough, and simmering broth, the kind of scents that wrapped around a person like a blanket. Chuck guided his mother to her seat, pulling out the chair for her and making sure she was comfortable before sitting down himself. The atmosphere was peaceful, the kind of place where people spoke in murmurs and smiled gently at one another. A few couples shared quiet conversations. An elderly man read a newspaper in the corner. A young mother fed her toddler mashed potatoes, laughing softly when the little one smeared them on his own chin. Everything felt warm, human, simple. But in the far corner of the cafe, the peaceful tone was interrupted by a cluster of noise. A group of wealthy teenagers, 4 boys and 2 girls, occupied a large table. Their expensive clothes screamed brand names: designer sneakers, glittering watches, and jackets that cost more than most people's monthly rent. They sprawled across their seats with the careless arrogance of people who had never been told no. One girl scrolled through her phone, giggling at something on the screen. Another teenage boy tossed balled-up napkins at an exhausted waiter, laughing as the waiter pretended not to notice. Their voices rose above the jazz background music, breaking the harmony of the place. Chuck noticed them immediately, though he said nothing. Years of discipline had taught him that not every disturbance demanded intervention. Sometimes the best thing a person could do was ignore the noise and focus on what mattered. Tonight, what mattered was his mother. The two of them studied the menu. His mother took her time, as she always did, tracing each line with her fingertip. She liked to choose something warm, something that reminded her of the meals she used to cook for Chuck and his brothers when they were boys: soup, baked chicken, simple casseroles. Chuck watched her fondly, remembering those days with a quiet ache of nostalgia. Around them, life moved gently, except for the one table that seemed determined to disrupt everything. The teenagers were growing louder with each passing minute, creating eddies of discomfort that rippled through the cafe. One boy slapped his friend on the back hard enough to rattle the silverware on their table. Another drummed his fingers on the edge of a glass with an annoying rhythmic clatter. A few customers glanced their way and then looked quickly back at their plates, hoping not to draw the teenagers' attention. A waiter approached the teens with a tray of drinks, trying his best to maintain a professional smile. One of the boys stuck out his sneaker and nudged the waiter's leg just as he passed, causing the tray to wobble. The waiter stabilized it at the last second, but the teens burst into loud laughter, slapping the table as though they had witnessed the funniest thing in the world. Chuck's mother winced softly at the sound, shrinking slightly in her seat. Chuck leaned in to reassure her, speaking calmly and quietly, trying to keep her attention focused on him rather than the noise behind them. But her gentle nature made her sensitive to disruptions, and he could see the tension in her shoulders, the small tremor in her fingers. She hated conflict, hated rudeness, even when directed at others. Seeing people mistreat workers always unsettled her. Chuck followed the waiter with his eyes. The young man's shoulders were tight, his jaw stiff, but he continued working, as though he had no choice but to swallow every disrespectful gesture thrown his way. It was a feeling Chuck knew all too well from his own childhood, powerlessness in the face of those who believed themselves untouchable. Still, he tried to refocus on his mother. He helped her adjust the napkin on her lap, poured her some water, and asked her about her week. She smiled at him again, though this time there was a flicker of worry behind her eyes. She, like him, sensed the shift in the room. The atmosphere wasn't the same. The cafe's warm glow dimmed ever so slightly, overshadowed by the arrogant laughter coming from the corner. The teenagers were getting restless. They were filming each other, mocking passers-by on the sidewalk outside, and baiting reactions from the staff. One boy threw a crumpled piece of bread onto a nearby empty chair, laughing hysterically at his own antics. The waiter who had brought Chuck and his mother their soup passed by the teens again, this time with a tray of steaming dishes. One of the girls reached out and poked his arm, making him jump. Her friends erupted in another wave of laughter. Chuck's jaw tightened, though he kept his expression neutral. Years of discipline taught him to keep his emotions contained, to calculate before acting. This wasn't the place for a confrontation, not unless someone crossed a line. The line, however, was inching dangerously closer. His mother tried to pretend she didn't notice the raucous behavior behind her. She lifted her spoon, gently blew on it, and took a small sip of her soup. Chuck watched her, feeling protective. She looked so peaceful, so vulnerable in that moment, that his heart constricted. He didn't want anything or anyone to disturb her tonight. But trouble has a way of finding those who least deserve it. It began subtly. The teenagers' voices lowered, but not out of courtesy. They lowered because something had caught their interest. One of the boys, the leader of the group, clearly the ringleader, nudged his friend and nodded toward Chuck's mother. A grin slid across his face, sharp and mocking. The others followed his gaze, and suddenly she was the center of their attention. Chuck didn't notice right away. He was pouring her another glass of water, helping her adjust her cardigan. But the subtle ripple in the teens' behavior like predators slowly circling their next target was felt by others around the cafe. A couple at a nearby table stiffened. The waiter paused mid-step, glancing nervously at the group. Even the jazz music seemed to grow quieter, as though the room itself sensed a shift. His mother, innocently unaware of being watched, leaned forward again to taste another spoonful of soup. The warm steam rose around her delicate face, softening her features. She dabbed her lips lightly with a napkin, her movements as gentle as always. That's when the boy, the ringleader, leaned closer to his friends, whispering something that made them snicker behind their hands. Their eyes stayed fixed on her, evaluating her, deciding something. And though no words passed her lips, Chuck's mother seemed to sense the shift in the air. She lowered her spoon, her hands trembling ever so slightly. She didn't look back. She didn't want to give them a reason to escalate, but her discomfort was obvious. Chuck noticed the tremble in her fingers before he noticed the direction of the teenager's stares. His instincts sharpened immediately. He followed her line of sight, then slowly turned toward the rowdy table in the corner. The leader of the group met his eyes for a split second and smirked, a smug, disrespectful expression that made heat rise in Chuck's chest. but he kept his face calm. As long as they stayed at their own table, there was no reason to ruin the evening for his mother. He turned back toward her, offering a reassuring smile. She tried to return it, but it didn't reach her eyes. The waitress returned with more bread and asked if they needed anything else. Chuck's mother thanked her politely, though her voice was quiet and frail. The waitress gave her a sympathetic look, clearly aware of the growing tension in the room, clearly hoping nothing would happen. But hope, unfortunately, has little power against arrogance fueled by wealth and boredom. As the waitress stepped away, the group of teenagers burst into another round of mocking laughter. Only now, it wasn't random. It was sharp, direct, aimed at her. Chuck felt something inside him shift. Not anger, not yet, but the coiling presence of something deeper. The protective instinct he carried throughout his life, the one that had driven him in martial arts, in defending the weak, in becoming who he was, stirred inside him with slow, deliberate force. He looked at his mother, whose shoulders had tightened, whose eyes had lowered to her plate, who tried desperately not to hear the cruel noise behind her. She wasn't used to being targeted like this. She wasn't used to cruelty of any kind. The warmth of the cafe felt thinner. The sun outside slipped lower. The shadows lengthened across the wooden floor. Conversations dwindled. The room waited, bracing for something it could not yet name. And though Chuck still sat, still appeared calm, the world inside him had already begun to change. He didn't know yet what would happen. He didn't know yet that these wealthy, spoiled, thoughtless teenagers were about to cross a line so severe it would shatter the peace of the entire cafe. But the moment was coming. It was coming with the quiet inevitability of a storm rolling toward a shoreline, slow at first, but unstoppable. And somewhere deep in his chest, Chuck Norris felt the first drop of rain. The cafe's warm glow, once comforting and serene, now felt thinner stretched like a fragile film that could tear at the slightest touch. Chuck sensed the shift even before he fully understood it. Something had changed in the air, a subtle but undeniable tension that settled in the space around them like dust disturbed by an unseen wind. He could feel the weight of eyes on their table, the sharp, probing stares from the group in the corner. He didn't turn toward them immediately. Part of him hoped they would lose interest. He hoped they would continue scrolling their gleaming phones, laughing at their own inside jokes, finding entertainment in something else. Anything else. But hope rarely influences those who have never been taught boundaries. Chuck's mother lifted her spoon again, but her hand trembled slightly. Not enough to spill the soup, not enough to draw attention from anyone except someone who loved her as fiercely as Chuck did. He watched the subtle tremor ripple from her fingers up her wrist. She lowered the spoon before it reached her lips, choosing instead to fold her hands neatly in her lap, as though trying to compose herself. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence told him everything. He turned his head just enough to glance at the teenagers in his periphery. They weren't trying to hide their attention anymore. Their expressions radiated the particular kind of arrogance that thrives on other people's discomfort. The ringleader, the boy who seemed to hold the group's orbit, leaned back in his chair, one arm draped over the backrest, a careless smirk forming at the corner of his mouth. His gaze flicked repeatedly between Chuck's mother and his friends, as though he were already crafting the narrative of their next funny video. Chuck wasn't close enough to hear their words, but he didn't need to. The world has a universal language for cruelty. It doesn't require sound to be understood. He saw their shoulders jostling as they nudged each other. He saw the way the ringleader pointed subtly with his chin, directing their attention like a conductor guiding his ensemble. One of the girls cupped her hand around her mouth as she whispered to the person next to her, her eyes shining with mischief. The others stifled giggles behind raised hands. The cafe staff noticed as well. The waitress who had served them before glanced nervously toward the group as she passed. Her steps grew smaller, more hesitant, as though she feared provoking them simply by walking too close. She caught Chuck's mother's eye briefly, offering a small, apologetic expression that admitted she had no power to intervene. Outside, the soft amber of the setting sun filtered through the window, casting long diagonal rays across the tables. Dust motes drifted in the light, floating peacefully despite the growing unease beneath them. Chuck's mother adjusted her cardigan, as though cold, though the cafe was warm. She couldn't name the fear, but she felt it. The ringleader shifted forward in his chair, forearms resting on the table, scanning the room as though choosing the perfect moment to act. He wasn't drunk. He wasn't high. He was simply bored, and boredom mixed with wealth often fermented into cruelty. His friends began a new wave of whispers, their eyes darting again toward Chuck's mother. One boy, leaner than the others, but with sharper eyes, raised his phone slightly, angling the camera in her direction. He wasn't filming yet, not fully, but he was testing the angle, preparing for something he expected to be memorable. Chuck saw the glint of the screen from the corner of his eye. He shifted slightly in his seat, his posture still relaxed but with an unmistakable shift in energy. It was subtle, but to anyone who knew him, even to someone who had never met him but understood the language of danger, it was the shift of a predator who feels the forest around him changing. The ringleader noticed the movement. His smirk grew. He lowered his voice further, leaning in toward his friends. Their laughter simmered beneath the surface, like a pot moments before boiling. One of them nudged the ringleader's arm, urging him on, though none of them seemed to know exactly what he planned to do. They didn't need to. They trusted him to deliver entertainment. He always did. Chuck watched his mother straighten her napkin, though it didn't need straightening. She smoothed it once, twice, 3 times, each gesture slower than the last. Her eyes lowered to her lap, avoiding the room. She was trying to remain invisible, trying not to give them a reason to see her. Her vulnerability was palpable, a softness that should have demanded respect, not ridicule. But predators do not respond to gentleness. Chuck adjusted his seat slightly, angling his body so that he could see both his mother and the group more clearly. He didn't want to frighten her with an overreaction, but he couldn't ignore the instinct that had been honed through decades of discipline. The instinct that told him danger wasn't coming, it was already here. The ringleader rose slowly from his seat, stretching as if to disguise his intent. He rolled his shoulders, adjusted his designer jacket, and tossed his hair with a casual flick, the sort of practiced movement that came from years of being praised without earning it. His friends fell into silence, anticipation tightening around them like an invisible rope. The lean boy raised his phone again, this time with less subtlety. The recording light blinked. They were ready. Chuck's heartbeat remained steady, his breath deep. He didn't move. The ringleader stepped away from his table, his expensive sneakers making soft taps on the wooden floor. He didn't look directly at Chuck's mother yet. Instead, he circled slightly, as though giving himself space to consider his approach. He took a few unnecessary steps toward the restroom, then stopped halfway and turned back, pretending to reconsider where he wanted to go. He wasn't fooling anyone. Chuck noticed the way his mother's hands tightened around the edge of the table, her knuckles whitening beneath her thin skin. She knew. Even if she couldn't articulate it, she felt that something was wrong. Chuck gently rested his hand on the back of hers, grounding her, anchoring her in the moment. She didn't lift her eyes, but she relaxed her grip just enough to show she felt his presence. The ringleader made his decision. He walked toward their table. Not quickly, not slowly. Just casually enough to pretend innocence, while ensuring everyone watching knew he meant to do something. His friends leaned forward, eyes wide, lips parted as though holding back laughter. The waitress froze mid-step, a plate balanced in her hands. 2 customers sitting by the window stiffened, their conversation silenced. Chuck remained seated. The boy paused a few steps behind Chuck's mother. He tilted his head as though admiring the view outside the window, though he wasn't looking outside at all. His eyes were locked on her. The lowering sunlight illuminated her profile, her soft, aging features, her careful posture, her hands folded neatly in her lap. To anyone else, she was simply a kind, harmless elderly woman enjoying dinner with her son. To him, she was an opportunity for attention. He glanced back at his friends. They nodded eagerly, one of them giving him a thumbs up. The phone camera zoomed in slightly. The air felt heavier. Even the jazz music seemed distant, muffled under the tension that suffocated the room. Chuck's mother lowered her head, as though hoping that if she appeared small enough, quiet enough, invisible enough, he would leave her alone. The ringleader stepped closer. Too close. He leaned in slightly, pretending to tie his shoe or inspect something on the floor. No one believed him, not the staff, not the customers, not even his own friends. The silence in the room tightened like a noose. Chuck saw him move but remained still, giving the boy the chance to step back and make a different choice. He didn't. The boy's hand twitched. The lean boy's phone began recording in earnest. Laughter flickered across the teenagers' faces like sparks before a fire. Chuck's mother's spoon rattled softly as she placed it on the table. The boy straightened up fully, inching closer to her, his shadow falling across her plate. She looked at the soup, unaware of what was seconds away. Chuck watched the ringleader's expression sharpen, a cruel decision settling behind his eyes. And then, as if the universe itself inhaled before impact, the moment paused just long enough for Chuck to feel the weight of what was coming, long enough for the entire cafe to catch the faintest flicker of danger, long enough for the boy to smile, and for Chuck's entire world to narrow into a single point of tension. The moment stretched so thin it felt ready to snap. The ringleader's hand hovered behind Chuck's mother, fingers twitching with anticipation, arrogance, and the naive certainty that whatever he was about to do would be funny, harmless, and praised by his friends. The cafe held its breath. Conversations died. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Even the ambient jazz felt like it dimmed, retreating into the corners as if afraid to witness what was coming. Chuck saw the boy's decision solidify, saw the shift in his posture, the tightening of his jaw. He knew the intent before the action even began. He felt the disturbance in the air, but he also saw his mother fragile, unsuspecting, vulnerable, leaning just slightly over her bowl of warm soup, still trying to pretend she felt nothing unusual behind her. Her shoulders were tense. Her fingers pressed lightly against the table in a silent plea for calm. She didn't turn around. She didn't dare. The boy acted. With a sharp, sudden movement driven not by strength, but by reckless cruelty, the ringleader grabbed the back of her head. His fingers dug into the soft silver hair at the base of her skull, twisting slightly as he pushed downward with a force that made the cafe gasp collectively. Before she could react, before she could inhale, before she could even utter a sound, her face plunged into the steaming bowl of soup. The liquid erupted in a splash, sloshing over the edges of the porcelain bowl and cascading in hot rivulets across the table. The force of the motion rattled the silverware and sent a spoon sliding off the edge, clattering onto the floor. Her hands shot forward instinctively, searching for balance, but the shock of the attack made her grip weak and ineffective. She was submerged for a moment, just long enough for the heat to sting her skin and burn her dignity. Her inhale turned into a gasp beneath the broth. She choked as droplets rushed into her nostrils. When the ringleader pulled his hand back, freeing her from the bowl, she drew in a ragged, trembling breath. Her face was drenched, dripping with soup that clung to her cheeks, forehead, and chin. Pieces of carrot and herbs stuck to her skin. Her glasses, if she had worn them, would have fallen. Her hair clung wetly to her temples, flattened into damp strands. Her hands, trembling violently now, rose shakily to her face as she tried to wipe the burning liquid from her eyes. Laughter exploded from the teenagers' table. It wasn't nervous laughter. It wasn't laughter of misunderstanding. It was loud, sharp, cruel amusement that cut through the silence like a blade. They doubled over, slapping the table, pointing at her, gasping between fits of hysterics. One boy wheezed with delight. Another nearly fell out of his chair, wiping tears of laughter from his eyes. The girl who had been filming held her phone in both hands, zooming in on the scene, delighting in the content they had created. The cafe froze. The horror reverberated in the stunned faces of every patron. The elderly man who had been reading his newspaper slowly lowered it, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. The couple by the window stared with mouths parted in disbelief. The young mother clutched her toddler protectively, shielding the child's gaze as if from a scene too violent to witness. The waitress stood rigid, her tray slipping slightly in her grip until a plate nearly tipped over. Chuck's mother didn't speak. She couldn't. Her breath trembled, her lips quivered, and her eyes widened in a mix of shock, pain, and humiliation. Her body curled inward, as if trying to shield itself, her shoulders rising, her head lowering. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear her vision from the hot broth clinging to her lashes. Her cheeks were flushed, not from the heat, but from the deep, devastating ache of disgrace. Chuck did not move. His expression remained eerily calm, though every muscle in his body had tightened into coiled steel. His mind registered every detail with painful clarity: the splash of soup hitting the table, the sting of humiliation on his mother's skin, the gloating amusement in the teenager's eyes. His peripheral vision caught the phone recording everything, capturing her suffering for their amusement. He saw the ringleader laughing so hard he had to grip the back of a chair for support. Chuck's mother raised her hand to her face, trying desperately to wipe the soup from her cheeks, but her fingers shook too much to be effective. Her breath hitched as she struggled to compose herself, her dignity shredded in front of a room full of strangers. She looked smaller than ever, like the weight of the moment had compressed her into frailty itself. The air in the cafe felt thick, almost suffocating. Every person inside felt the wrongness, the cruelty of what had just happened. But they were frozen trapped between shock, fear, and disbelief. No one dared intervene. No one dared speak. It felt as though all the warmth had been drained from the room, replaced with the cold, sharp sting of cruelty hanging in the air. The ringleader, still laughing, straightened up and mimed wiping his own face, mocking her trembling attempt to regain composure. He pointed at her with his hand, shaking it dramatically as though imitating her trembling fingers. His friends cracked up at the performance, delighted at the humiliating spectacle they had orchestrated. The boy with the phone zoomed in further, capturing every detail of her tear-filled eyes, her trembling lips, the soup dripping from her hairline. He whispered something gleeful to the girl beside him, who giggled behind her hand, thrilled by the cruelty recorded on her screen. Chuck's stillness grew heavier. His hands remained resting calmly on the table. Fingers relaxed, but his jaw tightened imperceptibly, a small but unmistakable sign of internal rupture. The temperature of his blood felt as though it had dropped, not risen, the kind of cold that precedes a storm, not heat. His breathing remained steady, but the focus in his eyes grew honed and sharp, like a blade being forged. His mother's shoulders shook with silent sobs she tried to swallow. She drew a shaky, shallow breath, her voice trapped somewhere deep in her chest, unable to rise past the knot lodged in her throat. She didn't look at Chuck. Shame held her captive. She didn't want him to see her like this. She didn't want to be the cause of trouble for him, even in her suffering. Chuck rose slightly from his chair, just an inch before easing himself back down. Not yet. Not while she was still drowning in shock. His first instinct was to go to her, to comfort her, to shield her from the stares, from the laughter, from the cruelty that had just been inflicted on her. But he saw the trembling of her hands. He saw the way she choked back tears. He knew he needed to approach her gently, with the same care he had always shown her since childhood. That came first. Everything else would come after. The ringleader wasn't done. Emboldened by the laughter of his friends, he stepped closer to the table, leaning over slightly as if inspecting his handiwork. The smirk on his face was wide and satisfied, the smirk of someone who believed himself invincible, protected by wealth, connections, and privilege. He made a dramatic gesture toward Chuck's mother, as though presenting her humiliation to his audience. His friends clapped quietly, egging him on. One of the girls even whistled mockingly, covering her mouth with her hand afterward, pretending to be shocked by her own boldness. Chuck's mother lifted her head ever so slightly, her eyes still flooded with tears. She blinked and a drop of soup pooled at the tip of her chin before falling onto her lap. She gazed at the tablecloth, at the mess of broth and vegetables scattered across it, unable to comprehend why this had happened to her. She had done nothing. She had harmed no one. She had simply existed in the wrong place at the wrong time. She looked small. She looked broken. Chuck's heart clenched. He placed one hand softly on the table, preparing to stand. But before he did, he reached gently toward his mother with his other hand. She flinched out of reflex, still too stunned to react properly. He paused, letting her breathe, letting her feel his presence, letting her know she was not alone. Then with slow, controlled movements, he rose from his chair. The ringleader froze mid-laugh. The smirk slipped slightly from his face as he noticed the shift in the air. The confidence in his posture faltered for a heartbeat, though he tried to mask it with another sneer. Chuck didn't look at him. He turned first to his mother. Her eyes lifted to meet his. They were clouded with humiliation and pain. She tried to apologize. He could see it forming in her expression, but he shook his head softly. She had nothing to apologize for. Ever. The cafe remained dead silent, except for the shallow breaths of those witnessing the aftermath. The teenagers' laughter wasn't as loud now. It dwindled into a nervous titter as they watched Chuck's movements with confusion. They didn't recognize him. They didn't know who he was. They didn't understand why the air itself seemed thicker now, heavier. Chuck took a cloth napkin from the edge of the table and dabbed his mother's cheek gently, wiping away the soup with the tender precision of someone treating something sacred. He brushed strands of wet hair away from her forehead, smoothing them behind her ear. His fingertips were gentle, soothing, full of an unspoken promise. He would take care of her. He always had. He always would. And after this moment, nothing would stop him. His mother let out a small, broken breath as he helped her sit up straight. He pressed the napkin into her trembling hands, giving her something to hold on to. She clutched it tightly, as though afraid she might float away from the reality or drown deeper in it if she did not anchor herself. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Chuck rested his hand on her shoulder, grounding her. Only then did he turn toward the boy who had dared touch his mother. The ringleader felt the shift in attention, like a physical blow. His smirk faltered. His friends shifted uneasily in their seats. The boy filming lowered his phone a fraction, though it continued recording. The girl beside him bit her lip, suddenly unsure whether they had gone too far. But Chuck didn't speak. Not yet. He simply let his gaze settle on them, cold, quiet, steady. A gaze that made the laughter die. A gaze that made the air stand still. A gaze that warned them, without a single word, that the line had been crossed, and there would be a reckoning. For a moment, there was no sound, no laughter, no clinking of dishes, no murmur of chatter. Only silence. A heavy, thick silence stretched across the cafe like a taut wire. The teenagers felt it before they understood it. The shift was subtle yet unmistakable, like the pressure drop before a storm or a sudden stillness in the air before lightning strikes. Chuck's steady, piercing gaze settled on them, and even without raising his voice, he changed the very atmosphere around him. The ringleader's smirk collapsed under that gaze. For the first time that evening, uncertainty crept onto his features. His arrogance faltered, claws slipping on the smooth surface of his assumed superiority, but pride forced him to stay upright, to pretend the look didn't shake him. His friends weren't as good at pretending. The boy with the phone instinctively lowered it. The girl sitting nearest to him tucked her arms close to her body, as though trying to shrink from Chuck's attention. Their expressions flickered with something very close to fear, primitive, instinctive fear that blooms when someone finally understands they've gone too far. Chuck didn't move toward them. Not yet. His first priority was his mother. He turned back to her with the gentleness of a son who loved deeply and fiercely. Her shoulders were still shaking. Tears mixed with the warm broth on her cheeks, leaving uneven streaks of moisture that caught the amber light from the windows. She tried to contain her sobs, swallowing hard, but the trembling in her lips betrayed her internal collapse. He reached out and touched her arm lightly. She flinched not from him, but from the overload of humiliation and shock still flooding her senses. It broke something inside him to see her like this. A woman who had spent her life shielding him, supporting him, loving him now, looking so small, so shaken, so wounded. "It's all right," he whispered without speaking. His eyes told her. His presence told her. The entire room felt the weight of his unspoken promise. He reached for another napkin. Slowly, delicately, he wiped her face again, brushing the soup away from her eyes and cheeks with the same tenderness one would use to care for a fragile painting. His hands were steady, controlled. Every movement carried purpose. She looked at him through watery eyes, unable to speak. Her lip quivered. Her hands trembled as she clutched the napkin he had given her earlier. She tried to apologize, but before she could even attempt to form the words, he placed his hand gently over hers. She didn't need to say anything. Not to him. The crook of her elbow shook again, a soft tremor running through her frail body. Chuck moved around her quietly, placing himself between her and the teenagers so she wouldn't feel their eyes burning into her anymore. He motioned subtly to the waitress, who had been standing frozen by the kitchen entrance with wide, horrified eyes. She approached with hesitance, clearly afraid of making the wrong move but wanting to help. Chuck gave her a small nod, a gesture full of authority and reassurance. It directed her without scaring her. She immediately stepped to his mother's side. "Can you take her somewhere quiet?" Chuck's eyes conveyed the message, even if he didn't speak aloud. The waitress understood. She gently took the older woman's arm, offering support. Chuck's mother resisted at first, looking back at him with fear that stepping away from him meant leaving him alone in this nightmare. But his steady presence gave her courage. She trusted him implicitly, as she always had. After a moment, she allowed the waitress to guide her toward the small alcove near the restrooms, away from the center of the cafe, away from the predators who had targeted her. She moved slowly, each step uncertain, her hands trembling as she clung to the napkin. Her wet hair clung to her forehead. Her cardigan was stained with soup, and still she tried to stand straight, tried to hold on to whatever strands of dignity remained. Chuck watched her go, watched her fragile frame disappear behind the partial wall. His jaw flexed slightly as he exhaled, not heavily, not loudly, just enough to recenter everything inside him. And then he turned back to the teenagers. The silence inside the cafe deepened. Even the air conditioning seemed to hush its hum. The customers, though pretending to look elsewhere, were entirely focused on the unfolding scene, every nerve attuned to the tension. The staff stood frozen behind the counter, knowing what they were watching was dangerous yet necessary. Chuck's gaze swept across the table of teenagers. They were no longer laughing. Their expressions had twisted into a mix of nervous bravado and dawning realization. The ringleader still stood near Chuck's table, but his posture was no longer confident. His arms hung stiffly by his sides, his fingers tapping restlessly against his thigh. His eyes darted between Chuck and his own friends, searching for validation, stability, anything that might tell him he was still in control. He wasn't. Chuck took a single step forward, just one, but the room felt it. It wasn't a dramatic movement. There was nothing sudden or sharp about it, and yet that single step seemed to shift the gravity of the entire space. The floorboards themselves seemed to tighten beneath his weight, as though bracing for impact. The ringleader swallowed. It was barely visible, the soft bob of his throat as the reality of the situation began to compact his arrogance. The boy with the phone backed up until the edge of the bench hit the back of his legs, preventing him from retreating further. One of the girls sucked in a sharp breath, gripping the edge of her chair. Chuck did not speak. He didn't need to. The silence around him was louder than any voice could have been. His presence radiated a sense of contained force, a pressure that filled the space between him and the teenagers. It wasn't rage. Rage is loud, explosive, chaotic. Chuck was none of those things. His calm was the worst warning imaginable. He took another step. The ringleader finally attempted to gather his broken confidence. He puffed out his chest slightly, squared his shoulders, and tried to adopt the casual arrogance he had worn minutes earlier. But his eyes betrayed him. They darted nervously, flicking toward his friends, searching for laughter, approval, anything that might bolster his crumbling ego. They offered nothing. In their fear, they abandoned him. Chuck's eyes locked onto his, and the ringleader felt a chill crawl up his spine. His bravado faltered. His lips parted slightly as though he wanted to speak, perhaps to apologize, to explain, to justify. But no sound came out. His throat tightened around the words, strangling them before they could escape. Chuck took a third step. Now he stood only a few feet away, close enough for the teenagers to feel the weight of his attention like a physical force. Close enough for them to see the storm behind his eyes, but he didn't reach for them. He didn't raise a fist. He didn't even clench one. His hands hung calmly at his sides, relaxed, composed. And somehow that was more terrifying than if he had come at them in a fury. Suddenly, the ringleader took half a step back. It was small, barely perceptible, but it was all the confirmation the room needed. The boy who had strutted with arrogance minutes earlier now recoiled from the man whose mother he had humiliated. Chuck tilted his head slightly, studying the boy in front of him. He didn't raise an eyebrow or twist his lips. His expression remained chillingly neutral, but his silence demanded something: an acknowledgement, an apology, a surrender. The ringleader said nothing. Chuck didn't force him. Instead, he turned his gaze briefly toward the lean boy holding the phone. The screen was still recording, the small red dot in the corner blinking as if mocking the gravity of the moment. The teen was frozen, sweat beating at his temples, his grip trembling. He glanced down at the phone as if realizing for the first time what he was doing. Slowly, very slowly, he lowered it, turning the screen toward himself, as if trying to hide it from the man now standing before him. Chuck's jaw tightened, just slightly. He took one more step, now standing directly before the table. The ringleader was within arm's reach. The teens' faces were pale. None of them moved. None dared breathe too loudly. Yet Chuck didn't strike, didn't lunge, didn't lash out. Instead, he slowly, deliberately turned his back on them and looked toward the alcove where his mother had been taken. He made sure she was safely seated, tended to, cared for. Only when he knew she was safe did he allow his attention to return to the teenagers. He inhaled once, a steady, controlled breath that steadied the world around him. It was the inhale before a consequence, before a reckoning, before justice. And in the stillness that followed, as the teenagers trembled under the weight of what they had done, every soul in the cafe understood that something irreversible was about to unfold. Something they would never forget. Something the teenagers would never escape. The moment his exhale ended, Chuck Norris prepared to teach them a lesson they would remember for the rest of their lives. The cafe held its breath as Chuck Norris faced the group of teenagers. The moment stretched into something deep and heavy, a silence so palpable it felt like the world had paused to witness what came next. Not a whisper rose from the customers. Not a plate clattered. Even the hum of the lights felt muted. The teenagers, moments ago full of arrogant laughter and gleeful cruelty, now sat shriveled in their chairs like deflated balloons. Fear hung over them like a shadow they could not escape. Chuck's chest rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm that radiated danger far more intense than shouting or rage ever could. He stood tall, his back straight, shoulders squared, but his gaze cold, measured, precise, was what made the teenagers' skin crawl. They felt it in their bones, the primal intuition that they had crossed a line no one should ever cross. The ringleader was the first to attempt a recovery. His eyes darted desperately between Chuck and his trembling friends, as though searching for the arrogance he had lost, trying to reclaim the persona he used to hide behind. He forced a crooked smile onto his face, but it faltered immediately, the trembling corner of his lip betraying the fear gripping him. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to utter a flimsy excuse or a forced joke, but nothing came out. His throat was too tight, his mind too scrambled to form words. Chuck didn't give him the chance to find them. He stepped forward with a calmness so controlled that it made the teenagers recoil. The ringleader stumbled backward 2 steps, his heel catching on the leg of a chair. He reached out and grabbed the backrest for balance, his knuckles whitening as he grasped it like a lifeline. His breath quickened. His friend's eyes widened. The boy with the phone tried to shrink into himself, pulling the device down to his lap, face pale with dread. Chuck's gaze locked on the ringleader, not with hatred, not with rage, but with something far more terrifying: certainty. Certainty that he would not allow what happened to his mother to go unanswered. Certainty that these children, intoxicated with money and ignorance, would learn the truth of consequences today. He closed the distance between them with 2 deliberate steps. The ringleader's body froze, as though every instinct screamed at him to run, but his limbs no longer obeyed. Chuck reached out, not with violence, not with a strike, but with a simple, firm grip on the boy's wrist. The ringleader flinched as if burned. Chuck didn't yank him. He didn't twist him. He simply held him, grounding him in place, and then, with a single movement, he guided the boy's arm downward, using his momentum against him. The ringleader lost balance completely. His knees buckled and he fell to the floor with a sharp thud that echoed through the quiet cafe. Gasps rippled through the room. Chuck stepped forward, keeping his movements controlled and efficient. The ringleader scrambled backward on his hands, his legs kicking frantically, as though trying to escape from a predator. Chuck crouched down, placing one hand lightly but powerfully on the boy's shoulder, pinning him in place. The teen sucked in a startled breath, eyes wide, chest heaving. "You don't touch her," Chuck said, not in words, but in the silent, unyielding pressure of his posture. The boy felt it, understood it, absorbed it so deeply that his entire body shook with the force of it. Before he could even process what was happening, one of his friends, the muscular boy in a Letterman jacket, sprang from his chair with a burst of misguided bravery. He swung a fist toward Chuck in a clumsy, desperate attempt to appear tough, perhaps believing that strength came from noise rather than discipline. Chuck didn't even look at him directly. With a slight shift of his weight and a swift, fluid motion, he caught the incoming arm mid-swing, redirected it, and used the boy's own force to send him crashing into the table behind him. Plates and glasses spilled to the floor with a crash, silverware scattering across the tiles like metallic rain. The boy landed hard on his back, gasping for air as the wind was knocked out of him. Another teenager, a tall, lanky boy, with nervous energy leapt to his feet, backing himself toward the exit. He looked as though he wanted to run, but fear rooted him in place. His eyes darted wildly between the door and Chuck, like a trapped rabbit looking for an escape that didn't exist. Chuck didn't advance toward him, but the boy stumbled anyway, tripping over his own feet and falling backward into a chair with a loud clattering crash. The girl who had been filming earlier let out a small cry of fear, dropping her phone onto the table. It landed with a heavy clack, the video still recording the chaos. Her hands trembled as she covered her face, peeking through her fingers with wide, terrified eyes. Chuck rose from his crouch and turned toward the next boy, the one who had been filming, the lean one with sharp features. His breath caught in his throat as Chuck's gaze landed on him. He clutched his phone with both hands as though it were a shield, though it offered no protection. Chuck didn't need to say a word. The teen slowly lowered the phone to the table, his fingers shaking violently. His chest heaved. Sweat rolled down his temples. He felt the weight of his own actions pressing down on him like a crushing burden. Recording the humiliation had seemed funny, entertaining, until the consequences of that cruelty manifested before him. Chuck's approach was not fast. It was slow, measured, even gentle. But the boy's fear grew with each step, as though Chuck's calm was more powerful than any display of fury could ever be. The teen backed up until his spine pressed against the wall behind him. He had nowhere left to go. Chuck reached out and placed his hand on the boy's shoulder, not harshly but firmly. The teen shuddered. Chuck glanced down at the phone resting on the table. Slowly, deliberately, he picked it up with 2 fingers. For a moment, the boy seemed relieved, until Chuck simply let the phone slip from his grip, letting it fall onto the hard floor where it shattered into pieces. The teen flinched as though the shattering glass were a blow to his own body. The cafe remained deadly silent, every customer holding themselves still, their breaths shallow, their eyes locked on the unfolding justice. It wasn't a spectacle, it was a reckoning. Chuck turned then toward the girl who had laughed the hardest earlier, the one who had egged the ringleader on. She attempted to stand, but her knees buckled beneath her. Her face paled, her lips trembled. She pressed her back against the booth as though trying to melt into it. Chuck didn't approach her with physical force. He didn't need to. The power of his presence alone made her shrink away, her former arrogance collapsing like a house of cards. Chuck then returned to the ringleader, who still sat on the floor, shaking, his palms pressed flat against the tiles, as though praying for the ground to swallow him whole. His breath came in quick, uneven gasps. His hair hung in disheveled strands across his forehead. His eyes glistened with tears he had no control over. Chuck crouched again, bringing himself to eye level with the boy. Something in the ringleader cracked at that, perhaps because Chuck wasn't yelling. Perhaps because there was no fury twisting his face. Perhaps because the quiet, cold disappointment radiating from him was somehow far more devastating. The ringleader's voice finally croaked out, a broken whisper. I didn't mean... Chuck didn't let him finish. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't need to. Instead, he simply placed 2 fingers under the boy's chin, and tilted his head up just enough to force their eyes to meet. The boy froze. His lips shook. His chest rose and fell so fast he seemed moments from hyperventilating. And then Chuck released him. He rose to his full height, towering over the table of collapsed arrogance, shattered pride, and trembling bodies. The teenagers watched him with wide, terrified eyes, each of them reduced to nothing but the consequences of their choices. Chuck stepped back, his breathing steady, his expression calm but unyielding. He scanned the room briefly, the shaken customers, the stunned waitress, the spilled drinks and fallen chairs. The cafe wasn't ruined, but its innocence had been broken. With controlled movements, Chuck turned away from the teenagers and looked toward the alcove where his mother waited. He could see her faint silhouette seated on a small chair, her hands clasped tightly together, her shoulders hunched in exhaustion and shame. She was safe now, safe, but wounded in a way no physical injury could replicate. He took a step toward her. Behind him, the ringleader let out a choked sob. One of his friends whimpered. Another muttered something resembling a prayer. But none of them followed Chuck. None attempted to flee. They were too broken, too stunned, too fundamentally shaken by what had just taken place. Their confidence, once as loud as their laughter, had been completely shattered. Chuck didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had given them something far more powerful than fear, understanding. They now understood consequences. They now understood the weight of cruelty. They now understood that their actions left wounds they had no right to inflict. Most importantly, they understood that they had chosen the wrong person to target, the wrong woman to humiliate, the wrong family to violate. The cafe exhaled collectively when Chuck walked away from the table of teenagers. It wasn't relief. It was awe. It was respect. It was the understanding that justice, however unconventional, had been served in full. But the story wasn't over. Chuck still had one more task, perhaps the most important of all. He needed to return to his mother. When the chaos finally settled and the tremors of fear subsided into a static, fragile silence, Chuck Norris stood alone in the center of the cafe. Everything around him seemed frozen in a moment, suspended between destruction and revelation. The overturned chairs, the splintered pieces of phones scattered across the tiles, the teenagers trembling in their seats or lying on the floor, the fragments of broken arrogance. All of it painted a picture of a night that would never be forgotten. Chuck's shoulders rose and fell with slow breaths. To anyone watching, he appeared calm, almost unnervingly so. But beneath that calm was an ocean of tightly controlled emotion, anchored by the sight of his mother's humiliation and the cruelty she had endured. His mind buzzed with the image of her trembling hands and tear-streaked face, and now, with the confrontation behind him, the weight of what truly mattered returned in full. His mother. She had retreated to the small alcove near the restrooms, guided gently by the waitress, as if she were a fragile bird, suddenly unable to fly. Chuck took a final glance at the broken teenagers, none of whom dared to move, and then turned his back on them. He didn't need to speak, didn't need to threaten, didn't need to look at them again. They had received their lesson, and their silence, their trembling, the wide despair in their eyes all proved that nothing more had to be said. His steps were slow and steady as he made his way across the cafe toward his mother. As he walked, customers parted instinctively, some stepping aside, others lowering their gaze out of respect. No one reached out to him. No one dared disturb the air around him. His presence now carried a weight that made the cafe feel smaller, quieter, more reverent. When he reached the alcove, he saw her seated in a small wooden chair, her hands clasped around a damp napkin. Her shoulders were slumped, her breathing shallow. Her cardigan was stained with what remained of the soup, and her hair clung to her forehead in damp strands. She looked older than she had an hour ago, more fragile, more shaken. But when she lifted her eyes and saw him standing before her, something inside her softened. Relief washed through her gaze like a small wave breaking the still surface of a lake. Chuck knelt beside her, lowering himself slowly so as not to startle her. He reached for her hands, carefully unfolding her fingers and peeling the napkin away. Her palms were trembling, her knuckles pale. She didn't speak, but words weren't needed. Her eyes told him everything. Her gratitude, her pain, her fear of having caused a scene, her shame for becoming the center of humiliation. He cupped her hands gently between his own, warming them with his touch. "Mom," he whispered with his eyes, not with his voice. She blinked and tears welled again. But this time, they weren't from humiliation. They were from the comfort she felt in his presence. She swallowed, rubbing her lips together before finally managing to speak, though her voice was soft, barely more than a fragile breath. I'm so sorry, Chuck." Her words trembled like loose leaves in the wind. I didn't mean to." He shook his head gently, and his expression shifted, firm but tender. She should never apologize for what had been done to her. He placed one hand lightly on her cheek, brushing away the fresh streak of tears that had formed. She leaned into his palm with a sigh, closing her eyes for a moment as if the warmth anchored her back to herself. "You did nothing wrong," he conveyed with his touch, with the unwavering expression on his face, with the steadiness in his presence. The waitress hovered a short distance away, unsure whether to approach. Her eyes were red from emotion. Clearly the attack had shaken her deeply. Chuck nodded at her, silently thanking her for guiding his mother away earlier. She returned the nod and hurried to bring a fresh glass of water, setting it on a nearby table without a word. Chuck stayed beside his mother until her breathing steadied, until her trembling hands began to calm, until the fear that had gathered like a storm cloud in her eyes began to thin. He spoke no words during this time. The silence between them was more intimate than any speech could be. It was the silence of a son tending to the person who had shaped his entire world. Outside the alcove, the cafe slowly began to move again. A soft murmur rose among the customers as conversations resumed in low, respectful tones. The staff whispered among themselves, glancing occasionally at the broken teenagers, whose earlier bravado had evaporated entirely. They sat hunched, eyes glued to the floor, too ashamed and frightened to lift their heads. Their phones lay shattered, their expensive jackets wrinkled, their confidence obliterated. Chuck finally rose from his kneeling position. His mother looked up at him, still visibly shaken but steadier now. She reached for his hand with weak fingers. "Can we go home?" she asked quietly, her voice hoarse. He nodded gently, squeezing her hand in reassurance. He placed an arm around her shoulders and helped her stand. Her knees wobbled at first, but Chuck steadied her with a gentle firmness that made her straighten with newfound courage. She clung to his arm, leaning slightly into his strength as they walked from the alcove back toward the main area of the cafe. The staff stood by the counter, watching with awe and respect. One of them, a young waiter with trembling hands, stepped forward hesitantly. "Sir," he began, his voice filled with sincerity despite the nervous quiver, "your meal is on the house. We're so sorry for what happened. You both didn't deserve that." His voice shook with indignation. Chuck gave him a small, grateful nod. He didn't need compensation. The apology itself mattered more. The gesture, the empathy, the recognition that something terrible had happened under their roof, it all meant something to him. As he guided his mother toward the exit, the cafe patrons instinctively shifted to allow them a clear path. Some nodded respectfully. Others gave looks of sympathy and shared pain. A few placed their hands over their hearts in silent support. Chuck met their eyes briefly, offering each a subtle nod of acknowledgement as he passed. Only one group didn't move, the teenagers. The ringleader sat slumped on the floor, his hands on his knees staring at the ground. His hair was disheveled, his face pale. The others were equally shaken. One boy rubbed his arm where he had collided with a table. Another hid behind his hands, sobbing quietly. The girl who had filmed the incident clutched her purse like a shield, her breathing shallow and uneven. They were broken in the way a storm breaks the surface of a still lake, shattered reflections, scattered in all directions, each piece reflecting what they had done. As Chuck and his mother approached the exit, the ringleader finally lifted his tear-filled eyes. They met Chuck's gaze for a split second. In that instant, the boy opened his mouth and struggled to muster the courage for a single word. "Sorry." It was hardly audible, barely formed, choked by tears and regret. But it came from a place raw and real. It wasn't enough, nothing could be, but it was the first kernel of understanding, the first spark of true accountability. Chuck didn't stop. He didn't engage. He didn't punish further. He simply held the boy's gaze for a fraction of a moment, letting him see the full weight of his disappointment, the kind that sinks deeper than fury, the kind that stays. Then Chuck turned back toward the exit and pushed the door open for his mother. A cold evening breeze brushed their faces as they stepped outside. The sky had darkened into shades of indigo and charcoal. Streetlights flickered on, their glow stretching across the sidewalk like long, glowing ribbons. Chuck guided his mother toward their car with utmost care. Once she was seated inside, he closed her door gently, taking a moment to collect himself before walking around to the driver's side. When he slid into the seat, she reached out and rested a hand on his arm. "You're a good son," she whispered, her voice still weak but filled with warmth. He didn't reply, but his eyes softened as he placed his hand over hers. The drive home was quiet, but a peaceful quiet, far removed from the suffocating silence of the cafe. She leaned slightly toward him, drawing comfort from his presence. He kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting lightly over hers, reassuring her silently with every mile. By the next morning, the world had changed again. The teenager's video still existed, at least the part that had uploaded to their cloud automatically before Chuck shattered the phone. It surfaced online, but not in the way they originally intended. The footage spread rapidly, igniting a firestorm of outrage. People saw the cruelty. They saw the elderly woman humiliated. They saw the laughter, the arrogance, the brutality of the moment, and they saw the man who walked into frame, who lifted her gently, who wiped her face with such care that the world fell silent watching. They saw the teenagers tremble under the weight of their own choices. They saw justice unfold in a way no courtroom could replicate. The teenagers' parents, wealthy and influential though they were, could not shield their children from public condemnation. They issued formal apologies. The teenagers themselves were forced into the uncomfortable spotlight they had once craved for the wrong reasons. Now their names were associated with shame, not popularity. Many cafes and shops around town refused to serve them. Schools reprimanded them. Their social circles shrank. Friends avoided them. Their privilege was no shield against the consequences of their actions anymore. In a world where apologies often come too easily and real consequences too rarely, this time things were different. Meanwhile, people approached Chuck's mother with kindness wherever she went. They offered sympathy, protection, respect. They recognized her as the woman whose son stood up for her with quiet, unwavering devotion. And through all the public noise, online debates, news headlines, community discussions, Chuck remained silent. He didn't brag. He didn't comment. He didn't seek validation. To him, the only thing that mattered was the well-being of the woman who had raised him. The only victory he acknowledged was her safety and healing. In the quiet of their home, with a gentle lamp casting soft light across the kitchen table, Chuck and his mother shared a simple dinner, a peaceful one. No noise, no cruelty, no humiliation. Only warmth, only love. Only the unbreakable bond between a mother and the son who would do anything to protect her. And that was all that ever mattered.